In today's video, a calculated hit in Kirby transformed into a spectacular demonstration of self-destruction, as four men exchanged their futures for a motive they steadfastly refused to reveal. It was a cold, deliberate killing that detectives would spend months piecing together. This is truth unraveled. And fair warning, there are no satisfying answers here, because these four self-proclaimed criminal geniuses left behind more open questions than the last episode of a TV series that got cancelled without a finale. We examine the case, the police investigation, and what unfolded inside Liverpool Crown Court. In the grey, rain-soaked streets of Kirby, the summer of 2024 didn't exactly deliver warm memories. But it did deliver a perfect case study in how four grown men can obliterate their entire existence before hitting 30. This is the story of Ricky Bry, known to those around him as Nuggy, and the four aspiring underworld figures who collectively decided that a quiet Wednesday evening in July was the ideal moment to transform an ordinary residential street into something resembling cheap gangster film with none of the style. Our four protagonists, and I use that word with the same accuracy one might use when calling a petrol station sandwich fine dining, were Michael Smith, Adam Williams, Connor Walsh, and Ryan Walsh Westhead. These were individuals who looked at the concept of a peaceful, law-abiding existence and, as a group, arrived at the conclusion that 3 decades of prison life sounded far more appealing. The setting was Quarryside Drive, a perfectly unremarkable stretch of road that, until the 17th of July, was best associated with the sounds of barking dogs and the distant hum of the M57 motorway. Ricky Bry was standing outside his own home that evening, in all likelihood thinking about nothing more dramatic than dinner or the kids' bedtime routine. Then the Kirby A-team arrived, and unlike the television program, this particular plan did not come together smoothly. It came together with a stolen Seat Ateca and an electric bike that looked more suited to food deliveries than contract killings. The logistical setup of the attack was, in its own bizarre way, almost impressively choreographed. You had what investigators would later call a tandem approach. On the road, a Seat Ateca, a car that communicates equal parts midlife crisis and budget ambition, carrying Williams, Walsh, and Walsh Westhead. On the pavement, Michael Smith perched atop an electric bike, dressed in a balaclava despite the July heat. A bold aesthetic choice. Nothing announces criminal intent quite like a woolly face covering in the middle of summer. It is the visual equivalent of walking into a bank wearing a sandwich board reading, "I am about to do something extremely regrettable." At roughly 6:35 in the evening, the group carried out what the prosecution would later describe as a recce, which in plain English means they drove past Ricky's address simply to confirm he was actually standing outside. Having verified their target was present with his family, they looped back around. What followed was chillingly brief. Smith brought the bike to a stop, produced a firearm, and discharged 4 rounds, 3 of them connected. Ricky Bry, a 36-year-old father, collapsed outside his own home as the attackers scattered. Now the escape. In the minds of Smith and company, they perhaps imagined this would be the part where they rode off into the sunset. What they failed to account for was that in 2024, virtually every front door has a camera, every road has a number plate scanner, and every criminal has a smartphone that functions less like a communication device and more like a personal tracking beacon gifted directly to law enforcement. As Ricky Bry lay dying and the neighborhood collapsed into the familiar horror of sirens and emergency vehicles, our 4 architects of catastrophe began the frantic business of attempting to disappear. The fundamental problem with joint enterprise is that a group is only ever as clever as its least intelligent member. In this particular case, the competition for that title was genuinely competitive. They retreated to their various addresses, likely riding a wave of adrenaline-soaked relief, completely unaware that the Merseyside Police Major Crime Unit had already begun to unravel everything. The black car had been clocked, the bike had been noted, the CCTV network had started its silent, thorough work. It turns out that cruising a high-performance SUV in convoy with a masked man on an electric bike is not exactly inconspicuous behavior. These were not men blending into their surroundings. They were men announcing their presence to every camera, every passing driver, and every resident with a window. For the following weeks, there was an uneasy, sweaty quiet across certain corners of Kirby. Smith, Williams, and the Walshes presumably spent their days glancing over their shoulders, wondering whether the next knock at the door was a neighbor or a tactical entry team with a warrant and a battering ram. The police, meanwhile, were conducting the kind of slow, methodical, unglamorous work that actually results in murder convictions. Cell tower data, ANPR logs, forensic analysis, digital reconstruction. There is a peculiar feature of the modern street-level criminal, an apparent physical inability to commit a serious offense without carrying a smartphone. It is as though they need to monitor their step counts while fleeing a crime scene. The digital trail left by this group was not subtle. It was not even moderately discreet. It was, to use a technical term, enormous. They were calling each other. They were messaging each other. Their phones were moving in synchronized patterns that, when plotted on a map, drew a very clear and very damning picture of exactly what happened on Quarryside Drive that evening. The breakthrough came when officers determined they had gathered sufficient evidence to make their move. And by move, I mean the kind of early morning door entry that tends to cause significant structural damage to hinges. By the time handcuffs were being applied in the early days of August, the bravado of that July evening had completely dissolved. The Seater-Tecker was gone. The balaclavas were hidden, but the evidence was not hiding at all. The police had the footage, they had the phones, they had the cold, unavoidable reality that a man was dead for reasons that, in the broader context of human existence, amounted to absolutely nothing of consequence. If the murder of Ricky Bry was a chaotic, poorly executed burst of street-level theatre, then the investigation that followed was its methodical and devastating opposite. While Michael Smith, Adam Williams, and the Walsh duo were presumably sitting in their homes, perhaps comforted by the belief that they had committed the crime of the century, simply because no tactical unit had burst through their door in the first hour, the Merseyside Major Crime Unit was in the process of converting the entire borough of Kirby into a high-definition prosecution exhibit. The investigation represented a yawning, almost philosophical gulf between criminal ambition and basic practical intelligence. These men had operated under the collective delusion that a balaclava renders a person invisible, apparently unaware that in 2024, the atmosphere above a British housing estate is essentially constructed from surveillance infrastructure. The first thread detectives pulled was painted in metallic black and registered as a Seater-Tecker in any sensible manual on conducting a discreet assassination, selecting a loud, distinctive, high-performance vehicle as your getaway car ranks somewhere between catastrophic and comical. It is the operational equivalent of attempting to conceal a grand piano inside a coat pocket. Investigators did not need to pressure informants or rely on underworld whispers. They had the automatic number plate recognition network, a system of cameras positioned across every significant road junction, watching traffic with the unblinking patience of a machine that has no interest in excuses. These cameras tracked the Seater-Tecker with the dedication of someone who has developed a genuinely unhealthy obsession. They watched as the vehicle performed its recce, circling Quarryside Drive multiple times with the restless energy of someone who cannot locate a parking space, but with considerably darker intentions. The car was not moving casually through the area. It was rehearsing, it was choreographing, and every camera in the vicinity had a front row seat. Then came the phones. It bears repeating, because it cannot be emphasized enough. The modern criminal appears constitutionally incapable of committing a serious offense without a GPS-enabled device, broadcasting their precise location to a satellite in real time. The cell site analysis was the prosecution's most reliable exhibit. It showed the defendants' handsets moving in a tight, coordinated cluster, like a small flock of deeply misguided birds following a migration route directly towards a murder scene. Detectives mapped the pings. They saw the group assembling. They tracked the movement towards Quarryside Drive. They noted the sudden panicked dispersal at approximately 6:35 in the evening, and they observed the period of digital silence that followed, which to any experienced investigator reads less like a quiet moment and more like a tight confession. When a phone is active throughout an entire day and then falls completely silent for the precise 10-minute window during which a man is shot, investigators tend not to conclude that the owner was simply enjoying a very peaceful rest. But the single most extraordinary moment of the entire investigation, the point at which the tragedy takes a sharp and almost surreal detour into pure absurdity, was provided by Ryan Walsh Westhead himself. In an age where people speak in hushed, paranoid tones about surveillance states and government overreach, Ryan had taken the remarkable personal initiative of installing his very own surveillance system directly above his front door. He had a Ring doorbell camera. These devices are typically used to screen parcel deliveries and keep an eye on suspicious activity in the street. In this particular instance, it was used to capture Ryan and his uncle, Connor Walsh, sprinting back into their home precisely 60 seconds after Ricky Bry had been shot. The footage was the kind of material prosecutors dream about during particularly satisfying nights of sleep. It was not simply confirmation that they had returned to the address. It was the manner in which they returned. They were not strolling back from a casual evening at the local pub. They were not returning from a late shift at a warehouse. They moved with the frantic, coiled energy that belongs exclusively to individuals who have just witnessed or participated in something catastrophic and are now desperately attempting to pretend they have not. They had, in the most literal and unfortunate sense imaginable, caught themselves crossing the finish line of their own freedom. There is a very particular brand of genius required to pay a monthly subscription fee to a technology company so that company can assist the police in constructing a 30-year prison sentence on your behalf. While the digital analysts were busy harvesting phone pings and doorbell recordings, the forensic teams were conducting their own version of a very thorough spring clean inside the recovered Ciateca. Once the vehicle was located and secured, it became something resembling a confessional booth upholstered in cheap fabric. You can scrub a car. You can douse it in bleach. You can offer prayers to whatever deity presides over failed criminal enterprises. But gunshot residue, those microscopic particles produced when a firearm is discharged, is among the most persistent and unforgiving forms of physical evidence known to forensic science. The particles recovered from inside the vehicle connected it directly and unambiguously to the discharge of a firearm, at which point the eye was nowhere near that car defense began to resemble a bedtime story told by someone who had not yet grasped how evidence works. And while the Ciateca was being examined in Prescott, the murder weapon itself had already been recovered the previous day, found concealed in wasteland near Domingo Drive, approximately a mile from the shooting location. Between the car in Prescott and the firearm in the undergrowth, the forensic framework of the case had been essentially constructed before the first full week of the investigation had concluded. The investigative team also devoted significant attention to the joint enterprise dimension of the case, which functions in legal terms as something of a bulk buy arrangement when it comes to murder convictions. Detectives were not required to establish beyond doubt that Adam Williams or either of the Walshes had personally discharged the weapon. They simply needed to demonstrate that each individual was a functioning component of the overall operation. By evidencing the coordinated movement of the group, the shared vehicles, and the relentless telephone communication between them, they assembled a portrait of a single, unified criminal entity. Whether your role was to observe, to drive, or to pull the trigger, the law regarded the four of them as one collective and deliberate act of murder. By the time the investigation formally concluded in late 2024, the evidence bundle was substantial enough to qualify as a physical hazard in its own right. The police had the car, they had the phones, they had the doorbell footage, they had the ballistics. The four defendants had been removed from their beds during early morning raids and transported from the casual arrogance of street life into the unforgiving fluorescent light of a custody suite. Detectives had sat across interview tables listening to the predictable rhythm of no-comment responses with the composed patience of individuals who already know exactly how this story ends. They were aware that within a matter of months, a jury in Liverpool would be watching the same evidence, and that no quantity of street-level composure would be sufficient to explain it away. The trial at Liverpool Crown Court in February 2025 was not, by any reasonable definition, a mystery. It was not a case that kept the jury guessing about identity or opportunity. It was, in essence, a prolonged and detailed examination of the question, how did four people genuinely believe this would work? As the defendants were brought into the glass-fronted dock, the judicial machinery of the British legal system prepared to test whatever loyalty pact had carried them this far. Michael Smith, Adam Williams, and Connor Walsh faced proceedings first, with Ryan Walsh Westhead following subsequently. The prosecution's opening was less a speech and more a forensic guided tour through an archive of the defendants' collective errors. The jury sat in attentive silence as the tandem operation was reconstructed for them in careful, methodical detail. The centerpiece of the trial was the recce footage. Projected onto courtroom monitors, the jury watched the Ceater and the electric bike circling Quarryside Drive with a repetitive, purposeful movement of something that had a very specific destination in mind. The prosecution was unambiguous. This was not aimless driving through a residential area. This was reconnaissance. This was preparation for a killing. The defense attempted to suggest the defendants had simply found themselves in the vicinity, deploying what might generously be described as the geographical coincidence argument, which implies that Kirby is a settlement so compact that four individuals can accidentally converge on the precise location of a murder at the precise moment it occurs without any prior arrangement whatsoever. Then came the doorbell footage. When the recording from Ryan Walsh Westhead's own property was presented to the court, the room absorbed it with a collective, almost tangible sense of disbelief. Watching a man return from a murder scene and walk directly into the evidence capture range of his own security device is the sort of detail that makes even experienced defense barristers quietly reassess their career trajectory. The footage showed the defendants returning with a physical urgency that had no innocent explanation. They moved like people who had just understood with absolute clarity that they had broken the cardinal rule and been caught doing it. The joint enterprise arguments presented by the various defense teams were, to put it charitably, a difficult sell. Each barrister worked to position their particular client as a passive presence, a kind of accidental bystander who had, through a most unfortunate series of coincidences, ended up seated inside a vehicle being used to facilitate a contract killing. My client was simply a passenger, they each suggested, apparently operating on the legal theory that occupying a seat in a murder convoy is a morally neutral activity. The prosecution found this interpretation unpersuasive. They returned repeatedly to the phone records, to the continuous frantic communication that tethered the bike to the car to the house, and the house to the crime scene. As the trial weeks accumulated, the social media personas and street-level identities the defendants had cultivated began to look increasingly irrelevant inside a courtroom where evidence carries considerably more weight than reputation. The sentencing, concluded in February 2026, reflected the court's view of the severity and premeditation involved. Michael Smith received 31 years. Adam Williams received 31 years. Connor Walsh received 30 years. Ryan Walsh Westhead received 28 years. As they were taken from the dock, the logic of joint enterprise arrived at its conclusion. They had come to Quarryside Drive together as a single operational unit, and they would now serve their sentences as four separate men, carrying the weight of one collective act, with 3 decades ahead of them to consider whether whatever remained unspoken was truly worth the permanent silence it had purchased. Ricky Bry is gone. The only people who know why are the 4 men now beginning the long, slow count of days toward their eventual release. And if the judge's closing remarks were any indication, the answer to whether any of it was worth it is, without question, no.